Outcome 4.2.4 Management Strategies and Policies for Achieving and Maintaining Healthy and Sustainable Outdoor Environments. These are strategies that can be adopted by public or private land managers. Public land is any land that is owned by the government or managed by the government, such as national parks, state parks, recreation reserves, and any other municipal land. Private land is any land that's privately owned by individuals or corporations, and the management of each of these is different. One of the private land managers who works to conserve outdoor environments is Trust for Nature, and that's the one that we'll be studying. So Trust for Nature, it's a not-for-profit organisation, and it works to protect native plants and wildlife in cooperation with private landowners. So it's working with people who actually own their land to use or operate that land in a way that's going to be more sustainable and protect native wildlife. And as much as 2/3 of Victoria is privately owned, so much of the flora and fauna in these areas is not getting the necessary protection. And the Trust was established in 1972, and it's now one of Victoria's leading primary land conservation organisations. They have several tools and several ways of operating that help to protect biodiversity on private land. We can see here the vision for Trust for Nature, their vision for the future. There's a shared expectation and responsibility among communities, landowners and governments to protect and preserve significant areas of privately owned land. Trust for Nature runs 4 main programs to conserve private land. First one is conservation covenants, which actually is a way of providing permanent protection for areas of privately owned land. There's a stewardship program, something called a revolving fund, and a land buyback scheme. We'll now go through each of the 4 main programs of Trust for Nature. So conservation covenants provide permanent protection for land. Landowners are able to permanently protect native plants and wildlife on their properties by placing a legally binding covenant on an area of their land. That means that land can't be touched or modified in any way. This is quite often done where people have areas of bushland on a farming property or a property, and that bushland might back onto native reserve, and by placing a conservation covenant on it, that land can't be adapted. It's one of the most effective ways to protect plants and wildlife on private land, because even if the property changes hands, the covenant remains, and so that part of the property can't be developed or cleared or used in any other way. It has to be maintained for the preservation of land. Now, people who are buying a property would know that this is in place before they bought it, so they would buy and purchase the property with that in mind, and knowing that they were going to be using that section of land was set aside for preserving native habitat. Through the legislation, it's statewide legislation, which means that it's legally binding. More than 1,100 conservation covenants in place on properties around Victoria. It is voluntary for the initial people or the property owners who initially place the covenant on their land, so it's something they choose to do in a way of setting aside a portion of their land to be used for conservation. And the Minister for Environment in Victoria approves the covenant being placed. This map then shows some of the area of Trust for Nature properties or conservation covenants. Right up in the top left-hand corner there, we can see a big red blob. We'll come to that later, but that's the largest protected private land in Victoria at Ned's Corner Station. And we can read there that through its different programs there's over 47,000 hectares protected. Second program is a stewardship program. So once a property's had a covenant placed on it, Trust for Nature offers support to the owners of that land to help return it to a more natural state. So if it's been farming land or if it's land that's been damaged in any way, then Trust for Nature offers support to that. As management advice, maintenance tips for the landowners, and help to maintain and improve the health of native plants and wildlife on their property. Trust for Nature also offers technical advice and information about incentives and species monitoring and things so that people who have covenants on their land can get involved in other government-run programs to help with the elimination of introduced species and help to improve the habitat that they have. Program number 3 is a revolving fund. The stewardship program does cost money to run, so the Trust for Nature have established a revolving fund to provide money to help with the stewardship program, but also to help get conservation and covenants placed on different properties. So funds are provided through donations, and Trust for Nature uses them to purchase environmentally significant land, which they then place a conservation and covenant on it and then resell that land back to a private landowner. Of course, once the covenant's on, it has to stay there forever, and the landowners are aware of this, and it's a way of increasing the amount of protected land in Victoria. It's a way used in protecting of native vegetation where other methods are less effective, or there could be pressure from urbanisation and increasing fragmentation of large farms into smaller hobby farms where there's potential danger or potential loss of habitat. Money generated through the sales goes through the fund to go back in and be used again. So the fund can keep on going forever. 47 properties bought and sold so far for around 5,000 hectares, so that's quite a significant amount. The final program of Trust for Nature is land acquisition. So the Trust for Nature actually buy and manage properties and themselves for conservation. They buy them with high conservation value, so where there are areas that do have particularly significant species or are in particularly significant locations. And again, in areas where there's less chance or lower chance of this being done by other agencies. Trust for Nature also uses some of these properties as showpieces to demonstrate private land conservation in a way of showing other landowners how things can be done. One of their best known properties, and that's the one that was the red section on the map before, the large red section, is Ned's Corner Station. 30,000 hectares up on the Murray River west of Mildura. It's the largest private land conservation property in Victoria. And we can see from the photos below how that area has changed from 2003, where it was a sheep grazing property, overgrazed, and with significant salinity issues and vegetation issues, to 2011, the same area, the improvement in the same area. Trust for Nature also purchasing a whole island near Phillip Island, and then that will be given back to the government, or given to the government, to go in as part of the Parks and Reserve system. So other ways of choosing and using land to in a way that ensures its sustainability. Okay, public land management. So the areas that are owned by the government and we see as state forest or other government-owned land. Who's the main public land manager in Victoria? Well, it is Parks Victoria. who work for who are a branch of Department of Environment and Primary Industry in Victoria, and their job is to manage all the public land in Victoria. So, Parks Victoria has got responsibility to work with national parks to when areas do have their conservation strategy or their planning, their zoning change. Well, Parks Victoria works to implement those changes and work with the other users to ensure the conservation of the land. Rangers have a big job to play. They're the face of the organisation. They're carrying out track modification and signage, but also surveying and assessing damaged areas and working on what areas are open to public use, what areas then can be closed off, assisting through all those. Okay, like I said, Parks Victoria, through the government, through Parks Victoria, can create and maintain conservation reserves such as national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. This is done in consultation with scientific organisations and other government departments. Developing the wildlife corridors. Now, we saw on our trip to Stanley how there's wildlife corridors and green corridors in the plantation areas of the Stanley State Forest. Parks Victoria and the government would work with the plantation owners who only lease the land and grow the plantations on government land to ensure that those conservation practices are introduced. Parks Vic work on reintroduction of species, run ecotourism, and work with the Indigenous population groups of different areas to allow Indigenous land management to be involved. And we can see some general management practices there that Parks Victoria use on the public land. Now remember, public land is not only national parks, but there's state forest and state parks and urban parks, and there's land that like the forest areas that we saw around Stanley and Beechworth that are then leased out for primary industries such as logging and mining. And parks still ultimately, or the government still ultimately controls and manages that land, and it's important that it's done sustainably. I think we just saw that one. Obviously, recreational management is a big part of Parks Victoria's role, and we can see on this slide a number of roles that they play with developing visitor facilities, maintaining trails for various users from bushwalkers and to four-wheel drivers and mountain bike riders. Be involved in search and rescue with organisations such as SES and police, management development staff, and delivery of education services. All national parks and most areas, and particularly through school holidays, the rangers run a lot of education and tours and guided tours, and being involved in planning and implementation of management strategies. So, every park or area in Victoria has got a management plan. These run to a few hundred pages to look at the conservation, to look at commercial use or look at primary industries use, and decisions are made about how much of any one thing are allowed on that. Be able to describe and evaluate these strategies, and that's what we're going to be working on in class time of how to evaluate where these strategies are working, how well they're working, and link those to specific environments that we visited. There's a nice little summary. All right. Watching this on a YouTube, you'll be able to pause this and not let it run over.